Welcome to today's episode, where we dive into one of Poland's most chilling and mysterious criminal cases, the story of Katarzyna Zowada. Katarzyna is the Polish equivalent of Catherine, so I'll refer to her as Kate for simplicity. Katarzyna can be a bit tricky to pronounce, and I want to keep things smooth and easy to listen to. Kate, a 23-year-old university student from Krakow, went missing in November 1998. And what followed was a haunting discovery that has since captured the attention of the nation and left investigators with more questions than answers. Her case is known for its disturbing details, baffling leads, and the intricate web of theories that have emerged over the years. It's the first half of the 90s. At that time, Poland was undergoing intense economic and social changes related to its political transformation. People were struggling with unemployment and inflation, but at the same time enjoying greater freedom and access to new opportunities. Krakow, with its historical and cultural heritage, was one of the most dynamically developing cities. In Krakow lives Kate, who has just finished high school and recently celebrated her 18th birthday on June 1st. Kate is an only child, living in the Czerwony district with her parents. Father Antoni, a school employee, and mother Bogusława, a psychologist and children's speech therapist. The family is close-knit and happy, despite not being particularly wealthy. Kate does not stand out in appearance, which suits her well, because she does not like drawing attention to herself. She has a calm demeanor, is considered helpful, and is someone you can always count on. She is a reserved introvert and does not have many friends. In fact, she only has 2 close friends from high school, and it seems that this small circle of friends is enough for her. Kate has an excellent relationship with her parents, especially her father Antoni, who is her best friend and with whom she shares many interests, such as literature and mountain climbing. Kate loves Krakow, especially the main market square, where you can often find her in a bookstore, the Passa's cinema, or a music shop. Kate is well-read and knowledgeable, so it is no surprise when she gets into psychology at Jagiellonian University, which was very difficult due to the demanding entrance exams. Unfortunately, after just 1 semester, she drops out of these studies. The following year, she takes up history studies, but she does not complete these either. In 1998, she begins her final studies in religious studies. She does not make many friends there, avoids contact with other students, is quiet, and usually sits at the back of the lecture hall. One tragic event significantly affected Kate's life and her mental state. When she is 17, she persuades her father to go on a trip to the Tatra Mountains, where, unfortunately, her father falls from a rock and breaks his spine. He survives the accident but is bedridden for many months in the hospital. Unfortunately, due to complications, he dies a few months after the accident. This is a tremendous blow for Kate, who blames herself for her father's tragedy, because it was her idea to go on the trip. She begins to suffer from depression, deeply affected by the tragedy, which causes her to withdraw even more. In the same year her father dies, which is 1996, Kate is 21 years old. It's Thursday, November 12th, 1998. Kate is 23 years old and has been studying religious studies for a few weeks. The weather in Krakow is typical for a November day, rainy and foggy, making the residents feel drowsy. That morning, Kate is getting ready for her classes. Recently, she has been in a very good mood, which her mother has noticed. She has also started taking more care of her appearance, dyeing her hair blonde and going on a diet. Her improved mental state may be related to attending therapy. On this very day, Kate has another therapy session immediately after her university classes. Her mother is also supposed to participate in the session, so the women have arranged to meet in front of the clinic building. Mrs. Bogusława is waiting for her daughter at the agreed time in front of the clinic. It is dark and cold, but Kate does not appear. The woman has a feeling that something bad has happened, because Kate is never late. She waits a little longer, but then returns home, thinking she might find her daughter there because something might have happened. Unfortunately, Kate is not at home, and there are no signs that she returned after her classes. Kate's mother has no way to contact her, so that same evening she goes to the police to report her daughter missing. The police accept the report but do not take it seriously, trying to reassure the worried mother by saying that Kate is an adult and might have gone to a party. Kate does not return that night or the next day. She has never disappeared without a word before, but the police do not take decisive action. The disappearance is treated as a youthful escapade, a trip with friends without informing her parents. Mrs. Boguslawa is helpless and begins searching on her own. She hangs up posters and asks people at the university and places where Kate often went. The posters bring results. She receives a few phone calls. Someone saw Kate on a bus, someone else in Zakopane City. In the early 90s, there was much talk about religious cults. Mrs. Boguslawa decides to follow this lead and visits the headquarters of various cults. But to no avail, her daughter is nowhere to be found. Finally, Mrs. Boguslawa decides to contact a private detective, Grzegorz Bohozowicz, who takes the case. The detective starts by visiting the university Kate attended, where he learns that she had not been attending classes for several weeks. This information shocks Mrs. Boguslawa because her daughter packed up every morning and left for the university, returning in the evening, sometimes talking about tests or essays to write. Why would Kate lie to her mother? Additionally, it turns out that Kate had been working under a false name as a cleaner at the Institute of Biochemistry at Jagiellonian University. It becomes clear that Kate had secrets unknown to her mother or friends. The detective and Mrs. Boguslawa begin to suspect that Kate had met someone, which might explain her sudden attention to her appearance. However, they find no clues indicating who this person might be. Despite all the information gathered, the search for Kate reaches a dead end. April 1999 arrives, and it has been 5 months since Kate disappeared. Mrs. Boguslawa is spending the afternoon in her apartment when she hears the doorbell. When she opens the door, she sees 2 policemen who ask for Kate's personal items, such as a hairbrush or toothbrush. They do not explain much, are reserved, and disappear right after receiving what they asked for. Sometime later, the police visit her again, this time with a summons to the prosecutor's office. On the paper is information about an interrogation in a murder case with particular cruelty. It is then that Mrs. Boguslawa realizes she has just learned about her daughter's death. On January 6, 1999, a small boat was sailing on the Vistula River in Krakow. It was a boat specially built for moving a pushed set, serving as a type of tugboat whose task is, for example, to push larger ships to the quay or push barges. The boat was slowly moving along the river when the engine suddenly weakened. The worried captain checked what was causing the machine to stop. He discovered that something had gotten tangled in the engine turbine. Together with the crew, he went below deck, discovered the metal engine cover, and was hit by a terrible smell of carrion. Not knowing what they were dealing with, they used a poker to pull out what was blocking the turbine. First, they pulled out shreds of blue material and then a human ear with a distinct earring hole. The men were shocked when they realized what they were seeing and immediately called the police. The arriving police and forensic pathologist confirmed the death, but without third-party involvement. Initially, they assumed it was the body of a suicide victim or someone who had accidentally fallen into the Vistula River, whose body had been torn apart by the barge's propeller while drifting down the river. A few days after the discovery, when specialists had broken down the remains into their components, a phone call from the Forensic Medicine Institute brought sensational information. The items tangled in the engine were not just human remains, but specifically the skin removed from a woman's body, sewn into the shape of a female body or swimsuit. The navel and genitals were intact, but the nipples had been carefully cut out. According to research, the skin had been in the river for a maximum of 3 weeks, so it was likely thrown into the water around that time. A week after the shocking discovery, 500 meters from the first stopping point of the barge, more body parts were found on a grid stopping impurities in the water, including a precisely cut leg at knee height and fragments of the buttock. Experts found evident signs of binding and violence on the leg. The people involved in the investigation were in shock. Never in their careers had they seen something so gruesome. They immediately began searching the database of missing persons, coming across the name Katarzyna, who had been missing since November of the previous year. Intense searches for the perpetrator began, especially since there was a high suspicion that the act would be repeated. They urgently needed to find out who did this and who the victim was. Creating a profile of the perpetrator, it was assumed that at the time of committing the crime, the person was a man aged around 22 to 35 years, probably a resident of Krakow, a sexually disturbed loner, possibly described by those around him as a weirdo, physically fit with average or above-average intelligence. The inflicted wounds and skilled skinning indicated he had experience working with a knife, so he could be a veterinarian, butcher, or hunter. It was also very likely that he would visit the victim's grave in the future, and that the crime was committed for sexual reasons, inspired by the character from the movie The Silence of the Lambs. Based on the work of profilers, the police began to look at men matching the description, of which, unfortunately, there were many. Verifying all leads was an incredibly tedious and lengthy process, for which several detectives were delegated. In April 1999, they searched the databases of missing women and collected DNA from the remains. In the 1990s, identification of bodies using DNA was a relatively new method. The investigation required comparative material to the DNA taken from the victim. In the missing persons database, they found many names, contacted their families, and asked for personal items. It was then that the police contacted Mrs. Boguslawa. After comparing the DNA, it was revealed that the skin pulled from the Vistula River belonged to Kate. It seemed that discovering the victim's identity would significantly speed up the investigation and bring the detectives closer to finding the murderer. But that did not happen. Kate's mysterious lifestyle in the weeks before her disappearance and her secretive personality stalled the investigation. The police had no leads, and as a result, later that same year, at the end of 1999, the investigation was closed due to the lack of identification of the perpetrator. This was a huge blow to Kate's mother, who could not understand why her daughter met such a cruel fate. It is worth mentioning that the police are assessed based on their success in apprehending perpetrators of crimes, while the prosecution is evaluated based on the conclusion of cases, regardless of whether it is a case closure or the identification of a perpetrator. Therefore, it happens that despite the genuine efforts of the investigators, the prosecution may close the case. Despite the closure, the officers involved in the case do not give up and continue to work. In the spring of 2003, investigators from the cold case unit resorted to unconventional methods, contacting the well-known Polish psychic and clairvoyant Krzysztof Jakowski. Jakowski has gained significant media attention in Poland for his purported abilities to locate missing persons and provide insights into various criminal investigations. Jakowski claims to have helped law enforcement agencies and families in finding missing individuals by using his psychic abilities. For his analysis, the psychic receives Kate's favorite stuffed toy, a large plush bear. He attempts to use his abilities, but the task overwhelms him, and he cannot provide much information about the murder. However, he draws a sketch of an old palace building that he believes is connected to the crime. The police, with the help of a historic preservationist, try to find a building resembling the one in the sketch, but to no avail. Jakowski also mentions seeing many churches in his vision, but nothing more. Thus, his cooperation with the police ends. Years pass, and no new leads emerge in Kate's case. The person responsible for her death remains at large. In 2012, the cold case unit still remembered Kate's case. At some point, they found strong leads in the files that needed to be checked. These leads, combined with the significant technological advancements over the years, prompted the Krakow prosecutor's office to reopen the investigation. As a result of this decision, Kate's body was exhumed for further and more detailed examinations. This exhumation made sense because Kate's skin had been preserved by a forensic pathologist after the first autopsy and remained in excellent condition despite the passage of time. Experts re-examined the evidence, and the results exceeded their expectations, as they found a large number of new traces, occupying 2 autopsy tables. These included various substances and chemical compounds, organic fibers not belonging to Kate, and most notably, plant remains, specifically tiny pollen particles. This last, seemingly insignificant finding was the biggest breakthrough. The plants to which this pollen belonged were characteristic of only a few areas in Krakow, but they were certainly not present at the site where Kate's body was found. This was an incredibly significant clue that could indicate where the crime was committed. The investigation also involved the University of Wrocław and their 3D laboratory, which reconstructed the murder. According to their tests, Kate was tortured before her death, and the perpetrator inflicted multiple stab wounds to her groin, armpits, and neck, probably intending to kill her by exsanguination. An expert from the UN, specializing in injuries caused by torture, stated that Kate's body bore very characteristic marks typical of sports injuries, specifically those inflicted by someone skilled in martial arts, in this case karate. These were incredibly important pieces of information, but the investigators' enthusiasm quickly faded as the case once again reached a dead end. At the police's request, FBI experts reviewed the case, hoping for a fresh perspective, but this brought little progress. The investigation moved from one prosecutor's office to another, and ultimately, in 2015, the case was closed again. Over all these years, the perpetrator was not identified, the location where her life was taken was not found, and the rest of Kate's remains, specifically her skinless torso, arms, or head, were not discovered. On October 4th, 2017, just before 3 p.m., a van full of police officers arrived with sirens blaring at the glass doors of a building on Trinitarska Street in Krakow's Kazimierz district, screeching to a halt. Masked operational agents jumped out of the vehicle and apprehended a short, stocky, middle-aged man. He had short, slightly graying hair, was wearing a gray puffer jacket, dark jeans, and very clean and well-kept sneakers. The man had just put his bicycle against the wall and was about to enter the building where his apartment was, but the police surrounded him and handcuffed him. He very calmly, without emotion or questions, surrendered to law enforcement. He got into the car with them without a word. This man was Robert J., aged 52, who was 33 at the time of Kate's disappearance. Out of nearly 500 public volumes of files, Robert's name appeared in the very first volume. At the very beginning of the investigation, he was questioned as one of the first people in the capacity of a witness. Robert was an intelligent and sharp individual, but a withdrawn loner, described by those around him as a weirdo. Robert did not have a good childhood. When he was born, his parents were young students and placed him under the care of an unemployed aunt, but 2 years later, she died. After that, Robert's paternal grandparents took over his care. He moved from Krakow to his grandparents' house near Wilicka, a town near Krakow. Robert's new home was filled with old antiques, located in a quiet area near the rectory. The move was not good for Robert because his grandparents were fanatical Catholics, and their main method of upbringing was beating. From a young age, Robert experienced physical and psychological abuse, with his grandparents administering cruel punishments for even the slightest infractions. As devout Catholics, his grandparents visited the church daily, of course taking Robert with them. When Robert sang too softly in church, his grandfather twisted his fingers as punishment. When Robert turned 11, there was a glimmer of hope as he finally returned to the care of his parents in Krakow's Kazimierz district. Although he was finally free from his toxic grandparents, life was still not easy in the new place. He faced the most difficulties in school, where he stood out from his peers. Robert was a problematic student, Often aggressive towards students and teachers, he was the class scapegoat, repeatedly mocked and beaten, and sometimes hid in school lockers to protect himself from his classmates. Despite these many unpleasant experiences, school provided Robert with a sort of solace in one teacher, to whom he confided, treating him as a mentor. This teacher, in turn, reportedly had a great fondness for Robert and reciprocated the boy's affection. After completing his compulsory education, Robert served mandatory military service in a morgue and at one of the institutes of the Jagiellonian University. However, he was quickly expelled from the institute after a strange incident where he killed all the experimental rabbits belonging to the university. In the early 1990s, Robert's mother moved to Canada for work. Robert remained in Krakow and, at the age of 26, saw a psychiatrist for the first time due to hearing voices. The psychiatric diagnosed Robert with a mental illness with paranoid episodes, and as a result, Robert received a pension, which was his only source of income. When his mother learned about his health condition, she decided to bring him to Canada. Robert lived in Canada for 7 years, returning to Poland in 1998 to the apartment his parents had left behind. He also learned that his parents were divorcing. His father, a Krakow poet, had moved out and left for another woman. This was a blow to Robert, even as an adult, and the divorce deeply affected him. To cope with difficult emotions, Robert began desperately seeking contact with people, especially women. He wanted to become more attractive, so he started going to the tanning salon and releasing his negative emotions by exercising and lifting weights. For a while, he trained intensively in karate. Robert harassed women, mostly his neighbors, confiding in them and sometimes being pushy. He spied on some and showed them his semi-nude photos, saying he was looking for a partner. Robert kept notes, recording the names and addresses of the women he sent letters to, often vulgar ones. These incidents went on for years, earning Robert the nickname, the Weirdo of Kazimierz. Shortly after returning from Canada, Robert took up work at the cloth hall in the middle of the old town square to improve his financial situation. In November 1998, when Kate's disappeared without a trace, Robert was still working there, and his mother was in Canada. In December, a few weeks after Kate's disappearance, people noticed changes in Robert's behavior. They observed that he became very religious, which was not typical for him. Robert became a regular attendee of the church near his home, where he actively participated in church life. Other parishioners knew him well because he had a regular spot in the church, the first pew on the left side. But there was always an empty space next to him. This was because Robert prayed very fervently and loudly, often gesticulating excessively, which disturbed other parishioners and possibly made them uneasy. At the beginning of this religious turn, in winter, Robert carried out a general renovation of his apartment, focusing mainly on the bathroom, where he removed all the tiles and laid new ones. In 2003, the media reported that psychic Krzysztof Jakowski was involved in the investigation, and Robert visited Kate's grave several times. This was known because the police had installed a camera at Kate's grave. Robert prayed, lit candles, placed flowers, and buried something in the ground. These were letters written to Kate. Years later, Robert told the media that he did not know Kate, but when asked why he visited her grave, he cheekily replied, "Why? Is it forbidden?" Everything started to fall into place. Without a doubt, Robert was the missing piece of the puzzle, and the profile created years ago by profilers matched him perfectly. This was not a coincidence, as the police had been gathering evidence against Robert for years, observing him and tracking his every move. The head of the cold case unit admitted that they had suspected Robert from the very beginning, waiting only for his mistake to be able to charge him. However, there were still many unknowns regarding the evidence. The investigation was classified, with little information reaching the public, and even fewer concrete details confirmed by the police and the prosecution. Most reports about what led to Robert's imprisonment were based on rumors and the words of various informants. One frequently mentioned aspect was Robert's confession to the priest. but the priest died before he could be questioned by the police, taking the secret to his grave. Allegedly, the priest had informed his superiors about this. There was also much talk about a letter Robert wrote, in which he detailed what he had done to Kate. Additionally, it was unclear what Robert wrote to Kate in buried letters or the nature of his friendship with a teacher from his school, with rumors of a possible affair and Robert's bisexuality emerging. This teacher was an interesting figure because he knew Kate's father both professionally and privately, as they worked at the same school. It was said that he was the person who introduced Kate to Robert, though these claims were not confirmed by the police. Robert's trial began. In some courtroom materials, one could see tables resembling school desks covered with hundreds of white folders filled with papers. These were volumes of case files. The indictment itself was nearly 800 pages long. It stated that Robert had used physical violence and deprived Kate of her freedom, drugging her against her will with chemical substances, detaining, physically and mentally torturing her, ultimately taking her life, skinning and dismembering her body. Robert acted out of pathological motivation with a sexual basis, and Kate's murder was to satisfy his pathological urges. Robert did not plead guilty and denied knowing Kate at all. His long time in custody undoubtedly sparked many controversies and questions. Doubts began to arise about whether the murderer was indeed behind bars, as there was talk of circumstantial evidence. After Robert's arrest, the police searched his apartment, tearing up the bathroom to the bare walls, removing wallpaper and carpets. It was said that a truckload of rubble was taken away for examination. Officially, it was known that investigators had found 2 hairs from the thigh, but due to the small amount of material, it was not possible to obtain enough genetic material. Microscopic analysis was carried out, determining that the found material matched Kate's hair. Many people questioned whether such analysis was reliable. As the crime scene, the prosecution pointed to a garden plot near the airport in Babits, belonging to a poet and former acquaintance of Robert's family. This place was identified because Robert had been seen there several times, and plants whose remnants were found on Kate's body grew there. The plot was thoroughly searched, both outside and inside, using georadar. The pond was drained, and the area and house were dug up. In a TVN Polish television report, the owner of the property did not hide his disagreement with the prosecution's vision that a murder had taken place on his land. Robert's defense attorney also had reservations about the actions of law enforcement and the prosecution, as dozens of witnesses were anonymous, resulting in many testimonies being incomplete. According to Robert's lawyer, he received statements taken out of context. Additionally, it was alleged that the prosecution had not provided sufficient evidence. In September 2022, nearly 5 years after the trial began, Robert J. was sentenced to life imprisonment for the brutal murder and desecration of the body of 23-year-old Katarzyna Zowada. Robert J.'s lawyer announced that he would seek his client's acquittal. The defense pointed to a lack of convincing evidence of Robert J.'s guilt. In his opinion, the justification for the verdict did not contain any direct evidence. As we reach the end of today's episode on the haunting case of Katarzyna Zowada, we're left with more questions than answers. Her story is one of unimaginable tragedy, marked by mystery, pain, and the relentless search for justice that continues to this day. Though the investigation has spanned years and countless theories have surfaced, the true circumstances of her death remain shrouded in darkness. Our thoughts go out to Katarzyna and her family, who still wait for answers. Cases like hers remind us of the fragility of life and the importance of truth, no matter how long it takes to uncover. Thank you for joining us in remembering Katarzyna and for helping to keep her story alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep seeking the truth.